All right, so welcome everybody here and on Zoom. It is my greatest pleasure to introduce Dr. Shula Green, who I have known for how many years, Shula?
Well, I want to say almost 15 years,
Okay,
maybe.
almost 15 years. I cannot claim to have the pleasure and to have her as my trainee while in graduate school because I was not her dissertation chair. However, that's when she thankfully decided to pivot from purely behavioral clinical work to neuroimaging. And so both Suzanne Heimer and myself we became involved in the training, and then she did a postdoctoral fellowship under my supervision or guidance or mentorship. And since then, with that one, actually, she got it at the first submission. She proceeded to get a K award also with a perfect score on the first submission. She got her R01 on the first submission. She got pretty much any other grant that she applied, including the Friends of Semel local award and other awards from international societies like the Whitlow Award from the International Society for Autism Research. More recently, she also got a grant from the Simon Foundation, which is absolutely a great work because she is going to be conducting with other folks here at UCLA some cross-species studies that relate to autism and sensory over-responsivity, which has been her main focus over the past over her career. But she is not only being interested in autism, she's also been doing and being funded to do work in youth with early life adversities. And I'm not going to belabor all of the wonderful work that she has been doing since she basically started her career here at UCLA, because you're going to hear a lot of that. But I'm going to say one other thing that she may or may not like to say, that she's been not only extremely productive on the professional front, but also quite productive on the home front, because she did have 3 kids. And this was in the midst of getting all of these grants funded at the first batch. Like literally, she wrote her, I think, her postdoctoral essay while she was pregnant. And so to those of us who did not dare to have so many kids, and I mean all of how she is now, she is I'm very lucky that she was able to stay close and continue to collaborate with me and Susan and others here, because she's clearly an asset to our autism program here at UCLA. So I don't think quite I made it funny. Did I butcher this? I'm sure I left a lot of other words, and she also got a NARSET. I don't remember what they're called now, but the NARSET and the Investigators Awards and the Brain
and Behavior Research Foundation.
But anyway, hopefully she forgave me because she knows that I am known to butcher in production. So without further ado, take it away, Phil.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Morella, for that very kind introduction. I do feel like I should say that there are plenty of grants I have not gotten, unless anybody, feel self-conscious or bad about that. It's just part of the game, right? Like we apply for lots of grants, and some of them work out and some don't. But I'm really excited to talk to everybody here today about the neurobiological basis of sensory processing atypicalities across children with neurodevelopmental conditions and some other clinical populations. And the work I'm going to talk to you about today is really kind of driven by my 2 identities. So I am both a neuroscientist and a clinical psychologist. I think my work I really try to integrate those 2 things with my work. So I really want to focus on how these neuroimaging studies can help us design better interventions for individuals who have these types of sensory processing challenges. Ooh, it did not like that. Okay. There we go. So what I want to talk to you about today is something that I think is a core component of how we interpret and navigate our world. So that is how we process and regulate our responses to sensory information. At any given time, our brains take in enormous amounts of sensory information, and typically we don't even think about it, right? We kind of effortlessly and flexibly adapt to or filter out ongoing or irrelevant sensations in order to focus on what's more novel or salient. We really take this for granted most of the time, but if this goes wrong, it can make life very challenging. So if you kind of imagine, this person sitting here trying to pay attention to these words on the page while there are all these different sounds going on around her, that maybe she's able to tune out in order to focus on this book. And if it's working really well, you might not even notice some of those background noises. Similarly, right now, I would guess that many of you kind of sitting here are not really paying attention to the feeling of the chair you're sitting in or the shoes you're wearing. The projector might be humming in the background, and you just kind of tune those things out in order to focus on more salient stimuli, like hopefully right now, the sound of my voice. But for individuals who have sensory overresponsivity, they might continue to attend to all of those incoming stimuli, leading to this feeling of overwhelm and too much information. And I do want to note there are a number of types of sensory processing differences that we see across different neurodevelopmental conditions, but I'm going to be focusing today on something called sensory overresponsivity, and that's because it's both particularly prevalent and particularly impairing across different clinical groups. Sensory overresponsivity, or SOR, is characterized by a negative reaction to or avoidance of sensory stimuli, and that can be things like loud noises, scratchy materials, or bright or flashing lights. This is really common in autism, and that's kind of where it's best recognized, where we pay attention to it and study it the most. But it's also found at high rates in many other clinical populations, including ADHD, anxiety disorders, children with early life adversity, etc. I want to give you a sense of how it feels to have sensory overresponsivity. So I'm going to share a couple of quotes from some people who have SOR. It feels like my brain is on fire. It's too much. You feel so sick, anxious, helpless, panicked. You can't tune out whatever noises you're hearing. They're just way too loud and they constantly go on and on. So you can probably imagine from those quotes that SOR can make life pretty hard. And we do know from research that it interferes with school and work performance, with friendships and social skills, with daily life activities. And it's also associated with more mental health challenges like anxiety, depression, and behavioral problems. So I started working in this field almost 20 years ago. And at that time, I would say it was pretty well known among individuals with autism, families of kids with autism, therapists working with kids with autism, that many children had these types of atypical sensory responsiveness. But there was almost no research on this at all. It was like this big giant blank box. So I kind of have this big blank white screen to represent how little we knew from a research perspective about sensory overresponsivity. So just as like a little example, we had no idea if children are experiencing the volume of sound differently, or if the same volume just kind of creates a more aversive response. So what I'm going to do today is share some of the key research areas that I've been working on so that we can understand sensory overresponsivity better, so that we can also treat it better. This is not an exhaustive list of everything that is out there that we need to study about this, but kind of some key areas that I've been focusing on. Oh yeah, how do I, okay. It's not showing up on my screen. Like I have to, oh, it's not on my screen. It's only on. I know, yeah, but it doesn't click it because, sorry about that. Yeah. So these are some of the areas that I've been trying to focus on in my research. So first and foremost, what are the neural mechanisms that are underlying sensory overresponsivity? Do these neural mechanisms generalize across different populations, or is SOR a distinct phenomenon in like anxiety disorders compared to in autism? How does SOR relate to or affect other clinical symptoms in these populations like anxiety or social functioning? How do the neural mechanisms and the relationship to behavior change across development? How can we use a better understanding of the neural mechanisms to develop better interventions, of which we have very few right now? And finally, kind of tying everything together, how do we actually accurately measure SOR so that we can do things like look at, changes based on treatment, or, how do we measure SOR across different groups, for example? And I'm going to add arrows because all of these different regions do interconnect with each other. Beyond being just an impairing and prevalent symptom, atypical sensory reactivity may actually play a very important early developmental role in autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. So I'm going to give you an example and kind of how I think about where sensory overresponsivity fits in the early development of autism. This might look a little bit different for some other clinical populations, but I'm going to talk about some of that later on. So emerging theory suggests that the social deficits we associate with autism may not be primary, but rather a downstream result of more general alterations in brain development, sensory motor function, and attention, starting from the prenatal period through the first year of life. So for example, many of the genes that we associate with autism are expressed prenatally or very early in the first year. And these are not genes encoding for complex social skills or language abilities. These are genes that affect very basic aspects of neurodevelopment, like cell adhesion or synapse formation. The first behavioral differences we start to see in the first half of the first year, again, are not these complex, classic social communication symptoms of autism, but rather sensory motor and attention differences. So for example, we see a decline in attention to faces between 2 and 6 months in infants who later get a diagnosis of autism. We also start to see some atypical white matter organization around this time. In the second half of the first year, we start to see some sensory motor differences or delays. So these early brain abnormalities likely affect these basic sensory motor and attention processes through which infants experience their world, which in turn alters experience-dependent strengthening of social versus other types of brain networks. And then all of these early neurodevelopmental differences have downstream effects on social development and communication. So that's why by the second year of life, that's when we start to see these more classic symptoms of autism, like difficulty with friendships or difficulty with pretend play and repetitive behavior. So whatever is going differently in sensory processing is probably happening very, very early in development. So that's why, as I mentioned in the previous slide, it's going to be really important to take a developmental perspective here. Before I get into my research, I wanted to share a little bit about my lab. I don't know how many people here listening to the talk are familiar with my lab, and we do take grad students. So, especially in case we have any rotating interested students interested in rotating the lab, I wanted to share a little bit about this. So my lab is called the Sensory, Cognitive, and Affective Neurodevelopment Lab. You can probably tell from that title that it's very interdisciplinary, multi-method. We focus on using neuroimaging techniques, especially fMRI, but also magnetic resonance spectroscopy to study levels of neurochemicals like GABA. And we use psychophysiological approaches like heart rate and skin conductance, and behavior, using, for example, standardized lab tasks of sensory kids interacting with different sensory materials. We're really interested in how these processes develop over time, as well as how we can create novel interventions, both those that are behavioral and psychopharmacological. So I'm going to start off by talking about my work identifying the basic underlying neural mechanisms of sensory overresponsivity. This is really what I've spent the most time on in the past decade or so, because what I'm going to as I'm going to focus on today, I really think these neural mechanisms can point us in new or kind of better directions for how to treat sensory overresponsivity. Given that this is a brain mapping seminar, I'm sure many of you here are very familiar with the brain, but just in case we have audience members who are less familiar with neuroimaging research, I wanted to point out some of the key brain regions that I'll be talking about today. So first, let me see, can I get my mouse back here to point to things? Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, so I'll be talking about the amygdala, which is very well known as being a region of the brain where related to kind of threat responses and anxiety, but it's also very important to just general arousal and attention and kind of which of many stimuli the brain is going to attend to. I'll be talking about the thalamus, which again, it's well known as a sensory relay station, but it also plays an important role in helping to integrate and inhibit sensory information processing. Over here on the right, we have primary sensory processing cortices, including visual cortex, auditory cortex, and somatosensory cortex, where we process tactile information. And then I'll be talking a lot about prefrontal cortex, which is an important region for behavioral and emotional regulation. For most of the MRI data I'm going to show you, this involves children and adolescents ages 8 to 17 years old, and they either have a diagnosis of an autism spectrum disorder or they're typically developing. And all of these children have IQ in the borderline range or higher. And so I want to just kind of note for a minute that this is not due to sensory overresponse, any characteristic of sensory overresponsivity. SOR is not correlated with IQ at all, which is actually one of the cool things about studying it. So we see SOR pretty consistently across the autism spectrum, regardless of IQ. The IQ cutoff here has more to do with just the challenges of doing MRI. Because children need to be able to respond to instructions and understand certain task demands, MRI research tends to leave out individuals who have intellectual disability, which is a problem when we're studying this characteristic that you definitely see across the spectrum. So one of the things I'll discuss towards the end of my talk is some work we're doing to also expand our methodology to ensure we can include children with intellectual disability in this research as well. Our participants are very diverse. They're relatively representative of Los Angeles in terms of race and ethnicity. And about a third are female, which is a little higher than normal for autism studies because there's a much higher ratio of males to females who are diagnosed with autism. We've been trying to oversample females, thanks in large part to my collaborator, Mirella DiPreto's study of sex differences in autism. So this is going to help us start looking at some sex differences in these sensory characteristics. So for these studies, we've used a range of mildly aversive sensory stimuli while children are in the MRI scanner. These are passive tasks where children are exposed to different types of sensory stimuli. So we've used a number of types of visual, auditory, and tactile stimuli, and we've been trying to use stimuli that are ecologically valid. So stimuli that are the kinds of things that kids complain about in real life. So one of our stimuli is actually created out of a scratchy wool sweater that we've purchased from a thrift store, just as an example. Another example are kind of loud traffic sounds of honking and beeping and traffic. What's exciting here is that the results we see in terms of group differences between autism and typical development in experiencing this different stimuli, we've now replicated across multiple studies with different participants and with different types of stimuli. So I'm going to give you an example here. This is from a study where children are being exposed to aversive auditory and tactile stimulation. On the top, you can see the responses in the typically developing children. On the bottom, the children with autism. You can already see it looks like the children with autism are having a stronger response. And in fact, when we directly compare the two groups, we consistently see this extensive hyperactivity in autism compared to typical development, where children are over-responding to these aversive sensory stimuli in many different brain regions, but particularly in regions related to primary sensory processing like auditory and somatosensory cortices, and also in regions that are related to attention and salience detection like the amygdala and the insula. So this is very broad strokes, though. This is like a big group of autism compared to a big group of typical development. But what we're really interested in are individual differences. So do individual differences in severity of these sensory overresponsivity symptoms relate to these brain responses? And in fact, the answer is yes, they do. So we've also replicated this a few times, where we found that children who are rated by their parents as having higher SOR symptoms also have greater brain activation to these sensory stimuli in the amygdala, thalamus, and sensory cortices. So this suggests potentially both a bottom-up mechanism where too much information is getting through and being processed by the cortex, as well as a top-down mechanism in which lack of down-regulation by the prefrontal cortex could lead to increased attention and affective responses from the amygdala. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about both of these theories and some of the research directions I've explored for each of them. So again, one possible explanation for sensory overresponsivity is that lack of inhibition from the thalamus could lead to too much information getting routed to the cortex. And then if there's reduced modulation of these inhibitory feedback loops between the thalamus and cortex, that can kind of create this continuous information feed. And as opposed to information getting kind of filtered out or gated. A second possible explanation is that increased amygdala activation to sensory stimuli leads to too much attention being paid to extraneous sensory stimuli, coupled with reduced prefrontal regulation of amygdala responses. And of course, these two kind of different networks or systems are connected with each other, and some of the data I'm going to show you next speaks to that a little bit. But I'm going to start off by talking about this, by talking about the thalamus. I found that one region in particular of the thalamus was hyper-responsive to the aversive sensory stimuli in the group with autism. And that region is called the pulvinar, which is this region here in the back of the thalamus. And this region plays an important role in integrating and inhibiting sensory information through inputs from the cortex. So I use something called a psychophysiological interaction analysis to look at how functional connectivity with the pulvinar changes when kids are experiencing the sensory stimuli compared to when they're not. So kind of how is the pulvinar communicating with these different brain regions differently during these sensory stimuli compared to rest? So what I found was, if you look at the top row here, these are what's happening in typically developing children. So we found that in typically developing children, there were a lot of changes in thalamic connectivity with the cortex, suggesting that the typically developing children are kind of modulating and inhibiting their responses to the sensory information. The group with autism, on the other hand, did not show any changes in connectivity with the cortex, and instead they showed changes in connectivity with limbic regions, particularly the amygdala. And in fact, children with in general, but particularly children with autism who had higher sensory overresponsivity severity strengthened this pulvinar to amygdala connectivity even more. So what this suggests is that this really important process of being able to kind of flexibly modulate and inhibit information in response to changes in incoming sensory information might be going wrong in autism. And so reduced thalamocortical modulation coupled with increased connectivity with the amygdala could create this kind of enhanced attention to sensory stimuli instead of inhibition. My mouse has left my screen and now I can't click on things, but that's okay. Figure this out. Okay. One way in which the thalamus might inhibit these sensory responses is through a neurotransmitter called GABA. So we decided to look at whether an imbalance in GABA, which is a major inhibitory neurotransmitter, to glutamate, which is a major excitatory neurotransmitter, might be related to sensory overresponsivity, as this would support that idea that the thalamus isn't inhibiting information the way it should be. So this was work done by my former postdoctoral fellow in my lab, Dr. Emily Wood, who's now a psychiatrist. And she measured the levels of GABA and glutamate in the thalamus using magnetic resonance spectroscopy. And what she found was that, in fact, children with autism who have higher levels of sensory overresponsivity have lower concentration of GABA in the thalamus, and they actually have lower GABA to glutamate ratio in the thalamus. So this does suggest that they may, in fact, have atypical inhibition to excitation, and that could be allowing too much information to be getting through the thalamus to the cortex. So it seems likely that the thalamus, and particularly its interactions with the cortex and the amygdala, are important to sensory overresponsivity. But I also want to talk about the second key mechanism, which is the amygdala and its connections with the prefrontal cortex. I was really interested in the idea of habituation, particularly in the amygdala, because the amygdala plays such an important role in attention and salience detection that I thought reduced habituation in the amygdala could be related to this kind of continued attention being paid over time to sensory stimuli. So I looked at amygdala responses to tactile and auditory stimuli across an 8.5-minute scan period. And I've broken this up here into thirds. So you can see the first third, the second third, and the last third of this auditory and tactile stimuli that kids are getting. So when we look at amygdala responses in typically developing children, it does pretty much what we'd expect it to do. They have an initial amygdala response to these novel stimuli, and then amygdala responses go down pretty quickly, suggesting habituation. When we look at kids with autism who have low levels of SOR, their amygdala response looks very similar. They have an initial response, and then it goes down. But when we look at children with autism who have high SOR, they show a different pattern. They initially show amygdala decreases, and then it goes back up again as if they can't maintain this amygdala habituation over time. Importantly, there was no significant differences in initial responses. So this suggests that SOR may be less about kind of an initial threat or startle response and more about this difficulty tuning out stimuli over time. And this could really lead to this experience people talk about of this too much information or sensory overload. We know from the emotion regulation literature that the prefrontal cortex plays a key role in downregulating amygdala responses. So I wanted to see if it might also play a role in downregulating sensory responses. So I looked at how functional connectivity with the amygdala changes when children are experiencing sensory stimuli compared to when they're not. This is the same type of analysis that I was talking about before with the pulvinar. And what we found was there was a difference in children with autism and typically developing children in the amygdala and amygdala connectivity with this orbital frontal region of the prefrontal cortex. But again, this is less important than I think individual differences among autism. So when we break this down between kids who have high versus low SOR, things get kind of interesting. So in blue here, we see children with autism who don't have sensory overresponsivity or who have very low sensory overresponsivity. And this group showed significantly more negative connectivity between amygdala and prefrontal cortex than either of the other two groups. And this pattern of negative connectivity between amygdala and prefrontal cortex is a pattern that we usually associate with prefrontal downregulation of the amygdala, because as prefrontal activation goes up, amygdala goes down. We don't see that pattern in the ASD group with high SOR in green here. And we also don't see it in the typically developing children, possibly because these children don't have hyperactive amygdala responses at all, so they don't need to downregulate. But this kind of showed us for the first time that kids with autism who behaviorally might look typical, these are not the kids having meltdowns or covering their ears or tearing their shoes and socks off. They may not be typical at the neural level. They might actually be working harder to compensate or kind of downregulate those amygdala responses in order not to show those behaviors. So they may actually have more effortful regulation to prevent SOR behaviors. And this is going to be really important as we start to think about coping strategies or interventions that might help with SOR. So I've talked about some of the basic neural mechanisms underlying sensory overresponsivity in autism, which include neural hyperactivity, atypical thalamocortical function, and reduced prefrontal downregulation of the amygdala. But as I mentioned previously, SOR is not specific to autism. We actually see this across many different clinical groups and neurodevelopmental conditions. And importantly, some of these neural mechanisms, particularly those involved in reactivity and regulation, are seen transdiagnostically. So these can provide us with some clues as to why we might see SOR across so many different clinical groups. So as I said, this atypical amygdala function and dysregulated prefrontal amygdala circuitry is seen across multiple conditions and symptom types, particularly those that are related to emotion dysregulation. So I'm going to give a couple of examples, particularly from the anxiety and from the early life stress literatures, because these are two populations I've been focused on specifically because they do share some neural mechanisms with SOR. So first, it's well known that anxiety is characterized by amygdala hyperactivity, particularly to sources of threat dating back at least 20 years ago. For example, we see here that children who have higher levels of anxiety show greater amygdala responses to fear faces. It's very well known that in anxiety and internalizing disorders, there's atypical amygdala prefrontal connectivity. So for example, this is a meta-analysis across many, many different studies of internalizing disorders showing that there's atypical connectivity between the amygdala and ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Similarly, children with early caregiving adversity, so children who've experienced really severe early neglect, for example, who are raised in institutions without a primary caregiver, also show amygdala hyperreactivity. So this is actually a study where they found both in humans and in rodents increased amygdala responses to kind of ambiguous, potentially threatening situations. And so this effect has been shown across species. Similarly, children with early caregiving adversity have been found to show atypical amygdala prefrontal connectivity. In this really great paper by Dylan G, they found that typically there's kind of this switch in adolescence to kind of more mature prefrontal downregulation of the amygdala, this more mature kind of negative connectivity pattern. And that matures earlier in children who have early caregiving adversity, which is actually associated with kind of resilience in those kids. So the takeaway here is just that these are underlying mechanisms that are not specific to autism and not necessarily specific to sensory overresponsivity, but that kind of generalize across different conditions that are related to emotional dysregulation. So just from the perspective of having common neural risk factors, though, we would expect high levels of SOR in these populations. And in fact, that's what we've found. So in a recent paper that I did with my former trainee, Caitlin Cummings, we found that children with anxiety disorders have atypically high levels of sensory overresponsivity, and they actually did not significantly differ than children with autism in their severity of sensory overresponsivity. Similarly, here at UCLA, I've been collaborating with Dr. Jen Silvers, who has a study of children who were previously institutionalized and then adopted from international institutions into the US. And I've been studying children who are adopted domestically from domestic foster care. And we found that both of these groups of children with very diverse forms of early life adversity have significantly higher sensory overresponsivity compared to non-adopted comparison children. Sensory overresponsivity also seems to emerge earlier and predict the development of mental health symptoms like anxiety. So it may also be important to early detection and prevention across different clinical populations. So theoretically, what this suggests is that there are many sources of impacts on this regulatory circuitry. So that could be genetics, whether it's a genetic propensity for autism or anxiety. It could be early environmental stress, and it can be prenatal impacts like alcohol exposure during pregnancy. We already know that these risk factors place children at a higher likelihood of developing a range of challenges like externalizing and internalizing symptoms and difficulty with attention and social and executive functioning. And I think a lot of times, especially in the clinical psychology world where I'm coming from, these higher order processes are really what we tend to focus on. But we might be missing a key middle layer. So that is that these neural mechanisms might first affect our more basic sensory processing, like how we modulate and respond to sensory information, which then in turn can affect these higher level processes here. So to show a really concrete example of this relationship, we showed in a recent paper that children with early caregiving adversity not only have really high levels of sensory overresponsivity, but that SOR actually mediates the relationship between early caregiving adversity and both internalizing and externalizing symptoms. So this suggests that atypical sensory reactivity may play a role in the increased mental health symptoms that we often see in these populations. So we're currently exploring more about how sensory overresponsivity in this population relates to neural responses to sensory information. So we recently found that children adopted from foster care do indeed show hyperactive neural responses to sensory stimulation, but in this kind of more circumscribed region of sensory cortex compared to that really widespread hyperactivity that we saw in autism, if you remember earlier. So I'm really interested in why this is. We're not sure yet. It could be that there are some sort of resilience or compensatory factors going on here that are preventing kind of the widespread hyperactivity we see in autism. So in talking about SOR as a transdiagnostic phenomenon, I started to touch on its relationship with other symptoms like internalizing and externalizing symptoms. This is something I'm really interested in and want to talk a little bit more about, particularly how sensory overresponsivity can interfere with social functioning, because that's really important to intervention. So to test this, I've been examining what happens in the brains of children with autism if they try to complete social cognition tasks with a sensory distraction. I'm going to give you an example of one of those tasks today. So for this task, we have children with autism and typically developing children ages 8 to 17 in the scanner, and they see the start of a scenario. So for example, this one says, John and Linda want to go swimming at the beach. And then they get one of two possible endings. So they either get a sincere ending. When they get there, the sky is blue and sunny. John says, what a perfect day. Or they get a sarcastic ending. When they get there, the sky turns dark and rainy. John says, what a perfect day. And they have to respond, did John mean what he said? Yes or no. So it's a pretty basic social inference task, but for half of the trials, they have this scratchy, aversive fabric rubbed on their inner wrist that serves as the sensory distraction. So we know from a number of prior studies that children with autism can complete this task with excellent accuracy, but they show greater brain activation while doing so. And we found that here as well, particularly in regions related to higher level language and social information processing. This is usually thought to mean that the autistic brains might be working harder to complete this task at similar levels of accuracy. But the focus here was what happens when we add a tactile distraction while they're doing this task. So compared to without the distractor, the group with autism then showed significantly reduced activation in those key language and social information processing regions. And they showed significantly more deactivation compared to the typically developing group. So this suggests that the group with autism may be so overwhelmed by this tactile stimulus that they can't maintain what was already pretty effortful processing in these regions. So this kind of starts to help us understand for the first time how sensory overresponsivity and sensory distraction might be taking away from social interactions in autism. And I'll talk about this again when I get to intervention. So far, I've been discussing all of these questions, neural mechanisms, generalizability, relationship with other symptoms across this really large age range of 8 to 17 without taking into account the effect of age and development. But anyone who studies children knows that most processes change with development. So a really key question is, when and how does sensory overresponsivity emerge? How does it change across development? And what are the neural mechanisms that might be underlying those changes? So to that end, I've been starting to look at the relationship between very early brain development and sensory overresponsivity in collaboration with Mirella DiPreto. And so the data I'm going to show you today is from a paper that was led by Mirella's former grad student, Dr. Tani Singh. I'm really excited to say this paper was just accepted for publication after kind of a long slog. So that's very exciting. So in the data that I'm going to show you, we looked at resting state connectivity in these babies while they're asleep. These babies are 6 weeks old, and half of them are at a higher likelihood of developing autism because they have an older sibling on the autism spectrum. The other half of the babies are at a typical likelihood of developing autism and do not have an older sibling on the autism spectrum. And we, again, while they're sleeping, we looked at something called resting state connectivity, which is how different regions of the brain are kind of co-activating with each other. I'm particularly interested in one network that's kind of thought of as one of many intrinsic brain networks of this resting state or co-activation at rest. And the reason I'm so interested in this network called the salience network is because this network is thought to play an important role in how the brain decides to allocate attention among many competing incoming stimuli. Research has already shown, particularly research led by Dr. Lucina Udin, that the salience network is atypical in autism. But I wanted to see whether atypical salience network connectivity could be related to greater prioritization of attention to extraneous sensory stimuli compared to maybe social stimuli, which could kind of play a role in SOR. So we looked at this salience network while these 6-week-old babies were sleeping. And we found that even at 6 weeks, we could see differences in salience network connectivity. So we found that the babies with a higher likelihood of developing autism had greater salience network connectivity with sensory cortices and the thalamus. Again, a really important sensory region. Whereas we found that babies with a typical likelihood of developing autism had greater salience network connectivity with prefrontal regions that are important to social information processing. These patterns of connectivity were actually inversely correlated, so that babies who had more connectivity with sensory motor regions had reduced connectivity with those prefrontal regions important to social information processing. So this kind of suggests a trade-off whereby infants who are strengthening one type of region may be less likely to strengthen the other type of region. This makes a lot of sense when you think about how babies develop. Most infants spend hundreds and hundreds of hours paying attention to faces and voices. And so you develop expertise in those things because of all of the time you spend paying attention to those things, and your brain kind of strengthens those networks accordingly. So you could imagine what might happen if an infant is being really distracted by extraneous sounds or feelings, and their attention is really being pulled away from those social stimuli. They might be developing expertise in those extraneous, processing those extraneous sensory stimuli instead. These early patterns of connectivity do seem important in predicting later behavior. So for example, in the typical likelihood babies, we found that those who had greater connectivity with prefrontal regions had better ability to share attention at 1 year of age. And this ability to share attention is a really important precursor to later language and social development. On the other hand, in the high likelihood babies, those who had greater connectivity with amygdala and sensory cortices had greater sensory sensitivity or sensory overresponsivity at 1 year of age. So I think that's pretty exciting that even at 6 weeks old, we can already see these differences in connectivity patterns in babies who have a greater likelihood of developing autism, and those differences predict behavior. And in fact, these atypical patterns of connectivity mirror what we see in older children and adolescents. So here I looked at resting state data in 8 to 17-year-olds with autism and correlated those patterns of connectivity with their SOR severity. And we found that children with greater SOR had greater salience network connectivity with amygdala and sensory cortices. Again, the same pattern we saw in the higher likelihood babies at 6 weeks of age. So this might suggest that individuals with SOR are more primed, even at rest, to attend to or attribute greater salience to primary sensory processing, and that these patterns are something that start really, really early in life and are maintained. So I'm really interested in how sensory processing develops, not just in infancy, but across childhood, adolescence, and into young adulthood. So I currently have an R01 where a major aim is to examine how the neural mechanisms of sensory reactivity and regulation develop across adolescence. And this R01 was based on some interesting preliminary findings. So we found, and others had found, that SOR tends to decrease on average across adolescence and into young adulthood, but there's a lot of individual variability within that. So while it may decrease on average, there are still a lot of people for whom this remains a big problem into adulthood. We also found in our preliminary data that amygdala reactivity to sensory stimuli seemed to be negatively correlated with age, whereas prefrontal activation seemed to go up with age in our autistic participants. So based on this preliminary data, I created this theoretical model of kind of what regulation might look like and what prefrontal engagement might look like across adolescence. And so this starts at age 8 because that's when we start scanning kids in our studies, but you could also imagine back in time beyond this. But if you look at the group in red, this is what might be happening in typically developing children. So we think there might be some typical process of developing regulation whereby, typically developing infants and toddlers are not that well regulated. If you've, spent any time around a typically developing toddler, they often are really picky about the food they eat, really picky about what they wear. They often are scared to go into public restrooms because the toilet flushing is so loud or the hand dryer is so loud. So we need more research on this, but typically developing toddlers do not seem to have very good regulation, sensory regulation. But, if you then think about kind of 8 to 10-year-olds, most of them who are typically developing, those types of things don't bother them that much anymore. So there's some typical process of regulation where it gets better across childhood, and prefrontal engagement during sensory stimulation may increase during this time. And it may peak in kind of late school age years and then decrease across adolescence as this sensory regulation becomes more overlearned and less effortful. On the other hand, children with autism, which I've divided here into kind of high and low regulators. So we may have a group that is more able to regulate that has a delayed pattern of development. So they're not actually starting to engage prefrontal cortex and develop these regulation abilities until mid-adolescence. And then their prefrontal engagement may actually go up across adolescence. And then we may have a third group of kids with autism who I call the low regulators who never develop that ability at all. And those may be the individuals who into adulthood are still complaining that SOR is a problem for them. What's really exciting is that we now have some data to back up this model. And so this is data that was just published by my grad student, Melis Chakar. And what Melis found was that in kids with autism, and I will say this is cross-sectional. We're collecting longitudinal data, but don't have that data yet. This is cross-sectional correlations with age. But she found that in children with autism, age was related to increases in prefrontal engagement, both orbital frontal and medial prefrontal engagement with development to these aversive sensory stimuli, whereas typically developing children show the opposite pattern, where they actually reduce medial prefrontal engagement as they get older. And this bottom row here is just showing a significant difference between the two groups. And when we plot this, you can see that there's a nonlinear relationship. So this is what's happening in orbital frontal cortex here. So if you look at the orange group, that's the typically developing children, and you can see they increase prefrontal activation until about mid-adolescence, and then it goes down. The children with autism are kind of more flat across the beginning of adolescence, and then their prefrontal engagement starts to go up across adolescence, so that by late adolescence, they actually show significantly greater prefrontal activation compared to the typically developing kids. Okay, so I want to talk about intervention. I know we're starting to run out of time, so I'm going to talk about intervention pretty quickly and then wrap up. So my R01 that I mentioned previously, in addition to just tracking these neural mechanisms over time, we also want to see if we can engage sensory regulation in children who are not doing it on their own, or maybe engage it earlier in development. So we're testing out two potential interventions adapted from the emotion regulation literature. So one is attentional redirection, which uses verbal cues to shift attention away from sensory stimuli and towards key social cues. Reappraisal trains individuals to think about the stimuli differently, for example, talking about something objectively as a reporter might versus how it makes you feel. These interventions are really similar to some of the strategies used in cognitive behavioral therapy. So if these work, they might be somewhat simple to kind of incorporate into existing interventions. So as a quick example of how we use this in the scanner, if you remember before our social inference task where kids had to decide if the speaker was sarcastic or not, and the tactile distraction really reduced the autistic kids' activation. We then added in this attentional redirection where we told kids, pay attention to the tone of the voice and the look on the face. So this is really, really simple, basic instructions, but we're kind of helping them hone in when there are all these different kind of pieces of information. What are the key social cues to really pay attention to here? And just these really, really simple explicit instructions allowed children with autism to re-engage those social and language processing regions and not deactivate any regions, even with the sensory distraction. Suggesting that the attentional direction may allow them to use regulatory regions like medial prefrontal cortex, which you see them engaging here, in order to sustain attention to the important social cues, even in the face of this sensory distraction. So these adapted CBT interventions, I think of as kind of a low-hanging fruit because the interventions are out there, we just kind of have to adapt them. But as I mentioned earlier, engaging this type of regulation could be quite effortful. It requires kind of a higher level of language and cognitive skills. It might not work for everyone. So we're exploring a few other directions as well. So first, I have funding from the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation and from INSAR to test the effect of a beta blocker, propranolol, on kind of neural and behavioral and physiological responses to aversive sensory stimuli. So if this has a short-term effect on kind of reducing some of those key neural mechanisms, we could then do a clinical trial to see if this could help kids over time. Second, I have funding from the Eagles Foundation, and this is in collaboration with my colleague here, Dr. Marco Iacoboni, to test the effect of transcranial magnetic stimulation to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, similarly on these neural mechanisms of sensory overresponsivity in autistic adults. So we want to see if neuromodulation could help engage those prefrontal regulatory regions. So these two directions are somewhat complementary. Propranolol might kind of be more of a bottom-up approach of reducing some of that underlying reactivity, and TMS to prefrontal cortex is more of a top-down approach where we can engage some of those regulatory regions. The last thing I wanted to talk about, this is really quick, is measurement. I really never thought of myself as a measurement person. I never kind of went out there to study measurement and create measures. That was not something I wanted to do. But there really are very few standardized measures of sensory reactivity. And so anyone who studies this kind of has to dive into figuring out creative and new measurement ideas. This also relates to what I was talking about previously of how we really want to expand our population to those with intellectual disability, and we need to be able to study sensory overresponsivity in a way that doesn't require people to lie still in an MRI scanner for an hour. So I've gotten really interested in using physiological measures like heart rate and skin conductance. We can measure heart rate on children with just 2 stickers on their torso, which is a lot easier than MRI. And we can do that while they're experiencing different types of sensory stimulation. And we found that heart rate in particular seems to pick up on sensory overresponsivity. So you can see here that kids with autism and high sensory overresponsivity show significantly greater heart rate responses to aversive sensory stimuli compared to either typically developing children or children with autism who don't have SOR. We've also found some really interesting kind of second-by-second differences in heart rate. So here, this is something called interbeat interval, where you're actually looking at the time between heartbeats. So more time between heartbeats means slower heart rate. And typically developing children do something interesting where at the onset of a new stimulus, they actually slow their heart rate. This is called orienting. And this is thought to give them a beat to kind of process the basic properties of the stimuli. Is this a threat or not? Do I need to go into fight or flight mode or not? And then there's some acceleration. The children with autism and SOR really don't show the same extent of an orienting response, and then they actually show faster acceleration, suggesting they might be going right into fight or flight mode because they're not taking that beat. So this was one of the inspirations for our propranolol study. Propranolol really brings down autonomic arousal, and the thinking is maybe we can, bring back that orienting phase. Maybe we can give them that time to process the stimulus and prevent going into fight or flight mode. I'm also really excited about the prospect of maybe being able to put heart rate monitors on young kids as they go about their daily life and be able to study SOR in a more kind of generalizable way. So that kind of pulls everything together. I think that it's really key that we have good measures, because otherwise we really don't know what we're relating the brain to, or we really don't know whether treatment is working effectively if we don't have really good ways to measure SOR. One final thought, I'd want to mention my inspiration. This is an autistic woman named Temple Grandin, who some of you may have heard of. She's written a number of books about her experience having autism and having sensory overresponsivity. And I actually read Temple's book in 2005, before I went to graduate school and started my career. And I was completely blown away by her description of sensory overresponsivity. And that is because at the time, the prevailing view of autism was really that these are kids who just had no interest in social interaction. It just wasn't interesting to them. It wasn't motivating. And she painted a very different picture where she really described her sensory experiences as primary, that she really withdrew from the world because it was so overwhelming from a sensory perspective. And it blew my mind at the time because really nobody was talking about that. And I think we've come a long way, fast forward almost 20 years, and we really have a lot more recognition of these sensory differences. We now have things in the community like sensory friendly film nights or autism sensory break rooms at schools and sports stadiums and things like that. So I do think that progress has been made. There's a lot to do, but progress has been made, and that's really exciting. So I just want to thank my funding sources, my lab, my collaborators, and many, many children and families who participated in our studies.
Right. Well, thank you, Shula, for a magnificent talk and up to the force, really demonstrating what I did not note in my introduction, which is that you have been a true pioneer in this field. Finally raising the collective attention to what are some of these the critical symptoms and issues that individuals with autism and with anxiety and with early adversity have. So truly a pleasure to see it all together. Let me see, maybe we can open if there are questions here on the floor, and then Shantanu, can you check if there are questions from the audience online?
Yeah. I was planning to come back.
Oh, well, I'm not talking anymore.
Oh, and if there are questions.
Sure.
So are we gonna be able to see them here?
Yes, I need lips raising their hand, so.
Oh, there we go.
Hi, thank you for that talk. It was really informative. I learned a lot. So I was wondering that there's like occupation, we talked about intervention. So one approach to this with occupational therapists is to like provide more sensory input. Like if somebody has tactile aversion, to do brushing and that sort of thing. It's a little bit controversial. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that direction of therapy. You're focusing more to like focus attention elsewhere, where that approach would be more to like give more sensory input to maybe desensitize.
That's a great question. So I think I'll start just by saying that I have a lot of respect for occupational therapists. And if if you have a child or if you're an individual with sensory differences or sensory overresponsivity, your first step should be to go to an occupational therapist, get an assessment, get a screening, and there are a lot that occupational therapists can do to be helpful. I think one of the challenges has been that there's very little evidence base for the interventions that are being used. So we don't know, we don't necessarily know how well they worked if there aren't research studies kind of determining the effectiveness. I think that my hope is that by identifying kind of what are the neurobiological causes or underlying mechanisms of sensory overresponsivity, we can develop interventions that really target those things. In terms of sensitization or desensitization specifically, I think that the habituation data suggests we need to tread cautiously there. I know that there have been a number, a handful, not a lot, a handful of people who have tried kind of like exposure therapy for sensory overresponsivity, where there have been single case studies where they've tried with one individual to kind of desensitize them to something specific. And it can sometimes be effective for what I've seen from these case studies. There's not a lot of research on it, but it could be effective for one specific thing, but it doesn't generalize. So as an example, like maybe you have a child who's really, really sensitive to a vacuum cleaner, and you could do systematic desensitization and exposure, and the response to the vacuum cleaner might go down, but the response to anything else doesn't go down. The response to a blender or the toilet flushing or whatever else doesn't go down. So it may not be addressing the underlying core challenge of sensory overresponsivity. It's only targeting that one, that one item. And I think our habituation data suggests that just exposing kids over time doesn't necessarily make that amygdala response go down. It might go up and down and up and down and up and down. So I would say, I don't want to say, no, that doesn't work. No, that never works. I would just say the evidence isn't there at this time that I know of.
Is there a level of SOR? So would you see a linear or maybe some kind of increase with increasing SOR and maybe increasing stimuli or symptoms or something? So
expand on that a little bit. Yeah.
So SOR is because of some stimulus. I guess some.
Yeah. You're having a response. I guess yes. Yeah. You're having a response.
So
yeah.
That stimulus,
does the response increase? That's a great question. I think that comes back to like, how do we measure this? And there are so many ways to the way we tend to measure sensory overresponsivity right now is more from a clinical perspective. So we have parents fill out questionnaires on, do these different things bother your child? Or how much do they bother them out in the world, as opposed to in the lab measuring a direct dose response type of relationship. So I think that would sort of require developing new measures that we don't have right now. I mean, we can see some of the measures we're working on now are lab-based measures where you have kids interact with different sensory materials and you look for a response. I will say it has been extremely hard to even measure a difference between a mild and severe response, let alone what we've actually started doing is just measure, do kids have a response or not? Because it's so subjective. Like, what does it mean to have a response? How much are you grimacing? How much are you and there are so many different factors that can feed into how a child responds. And we have kids who internally hate it and don't show any outward response. I do think, though, that's maybe where the physiology comes in. Like, we can definitely get a dose response relationship there in terms of like, how much is their heart rate going up in a more continuous way. So that's why I'm excited about those measures.
But I was thinking of more of a saturation point of view. So how much is enough? So you increase the stimulus and beyond a certain point, you suddenly just stop processing anything.
Mm.
And could that be an intervention? That's probably crazy.
But we can chat more later. That sounds like a very interesting conversation. Yeah.
Are there other questions online? I have one, but maybe I shouldn't push it you and I can talk about it later. But coming back to the data in babies, right? We show that in the brain at 6 weeks already, we show the imprint of differential processing, or we can try and map that onto differential attentional preferences. And of course, it will take quite some time before these babies can give us very strong, clues that this is how they're experiencing their environment. It takes a while before they're able to close, their hands to cover their ears or start pulling their clothes off. And so we also know that it's a time that is so important for early social development, right? If you're not paying attention to your conspecific, you're really going to be screwed in terms of your social development. And we also know that is a time of, incredible strong neuroplasticity. And so we would want to be able, you would like to think that if we could tweak something that early on, that we could really steer development in a more normative or less, optimal trajectory. So what could we do that early in development that could help these babies who obviously are not going to be able to follow instructions or to downregulate their responses? What can we do to perhaps, to increase resiliency, to improve outcome?
I think that's like the question of the hour or the day or whatever, the question of the moment. I would say that I want to be able to measure this better in babies and understand what's really happening before we start jumping into intervention, because we need to be careful. And we just have no good measures right now of how to study this in babies. So, for example, if we can find heart rate signatures of sensory overresponsivity and put heart rate little heart rate bands on babies as they're going about their day and start to measure when is their heart rate going up? Like, what are the things that are pulling their attention? When is this a problem? I would want to do that first. And then maybe if we start gathering that information, that will give us a better sense of where are the challenges? Where are these babies getting overwhelmed? How do we deal with that? Yeah.
We cannot collect babies in the scanner to figure out how that is not stimulate.
Amy has a question.
Okay. Oh no. You're
Amy, can you?
Yeah. Has anyone examined whether there's a correlation between this sensory overreactivity and what is known as enhanced perceptual functioning in autism?
That is such a good question. And the answer is basically no. And I think that this is a huge problem. And I think what you're getting at is this issue is that there are so many types of sensory functions and so many levels of sensory functions. And so many modalities of sensory functions, right? We can look at visual and auditory and tactile and proprioceptive. We can also look at detection, like how strong does a stimulus have to be in order for you to detect it? How different do two stimuli need to be in order for you to differentiate them? What level of it bothers you? How do you react to it behaviorally? So there are all these different levels. And then we have different types of reactions, right? We have under responsivity, over responsivity. There are many people who seek out certain sensations. And so in addition to the measurement issue, which I brought up, a big problem in this field has been that the people studying these different things aren't necessarily talking to each other or integrating their research or linking these things together. So I think that's a major direction that I want to go in, and we're starting to collect data now that we can do that with, but I don't have the answers yet. I don't have any results for you, but I think that's really important. And I think that we need to those of us doing different types of sensory research need to talk to each other and find ways to integrate these different pieces.
Thanks.
There are no other questions. Let's thank Shula for such a great